It is said of the poetry of Andrew Schelling that he is, quote, locating language in watersheds and continental ridges, in rocks and plants. A poet of ancient texts and teachings, Schelling tracks the history of language and reads the world. Not a moment too soon either, as we're in a time of whole systems transition some are calling the polycrisis, and we need as many poets practicing the role of person who notices what they notice, in the words of Allen Ginsberg. Sanskrit translations, a deep bioregional sense of place, and homages to dead, mostly poet friends, makes his new book a compelling distillation of subjects he's been tracking for over 40 years. Author of Tracks Along the Left Coast, Jaime D'Angulo, and Pacific Coast Culture, from the Arapaho Songbook and many other titles, Andrew Schelling lives in the mountains outside of Boulder, Colorado, and teaches poetry in Sanskrit at Naropa University. The new book is Forest, Temples, and Glacial Rivers, and we welcome him via Zoom. Hola, Andrew.
Thank you, Paul. Good to be here.
Good to talk to you again. I'm very grateful to have this kind of access to your work. It's really a blessing. Is there a poem from the book that you see as sort of a signature piece that gives folks an understanding of where you're going with this and that you would read for us?
Sure, I'll just begin with the beginning. I'll read the opening poem, though most of the book um, has a location in Turtle Island or a North American interconnection of bioregions and watersheds. I open the book with a poem coming out of a walk across Scotland I did with the poet Jerry Luce, who died just this year. He was a really considerable poet and botanist and great walker. And we took a uh, east to west walk across the length of Scotland about 13 years ago. Jerry was a minimalist poet, as many of the Scottish poets are. So this poem is called For a Scottish Minimalist at the Antonine Wall. And I want to just quick note, which appears in the back, better known as Hadrian's Wall, built by the Emperor Hadrian um, and his Roman legions when they were on the British Isles to seal off the northern barbarian regions from the conquered Roman holdings. Eventually, further north across southern Scotland, they built the Antonine Wall for similar purposes as the Roman legions pressed north. For a Scottish minimalist at the Antonine Wall, this unmortared rock wall seals a Roman battalion off from the shaggy tribal people north, a fur and feather clad people, a leather and flint arrow people. Listen to the rough, throaty gibberish of their songs. Their war paint scares the boyish conscripts, far from their homelands, far from Rome and the vineyards, from wine that gives you a moment of courage, the girls with mouth-sized breasts, thighs smelling of almond oil. Today, tiny poems get swapped. Coins of friendship at a place iron arrows bristled under the blue, fog, moon, and stench of fear. It seems impossible that a poem can withstand lithium, cobalt, plutonium, or Facebook. New chemicals drip into the sea and soil. Is there a chance poems might slip a gap a fence, or burrow under a rock? It is told in my country how Coyote found out the secret of fences. Bob wire let him through. A tuft of blue fur, you gotta look close. On the razor barb, he barked and it let him through. I like to believe Coyote, like these funny mangled poems of ours, outlasts petrochemicals and concrete, rises above the cold compounds of nature that decay and disappear. But no way we live standing on these old stone ramparts. No way we live long enough to raise a friendly hand, to be sure.
I love how you slipped Facebook in there. That's classic, classic surprise mind. But no way we live standing on those old, no, no. What's the word? I like to think these funny mangled poems of ours outlast chemical photochemicals and concrete, but it does. They do, don't they?
They do. Yeah, they do. And you mentioned the poly crisis, so we don't know what the future holds, but we certainly know that there are poems that have survived for a long, long time. And even if certain poems don't survive, maybe they inspire other poems that give some heart, give some guidance into the future.
They kind of lie there in the psychic substrate, though, don't they?
I think they do. I think they do. That's our hope as poets, that we're reaching into sort of deep, deep wells that are not just personal, but are, species wide and maybe much more than species.
Can you take us through how a book of poems comes together for you these days?
Uh, in many stages, it begins with the uncertainty that I'll ever write another poem in my life. And then suddenly a poem begins to appear and another poem and another poem. And at some point, I will typically realize that I'm on my way to some kind of new collection. And I like as soon as I can to begin to envision a book. So I will think of a title, I'll make a title page, I'll make a copyright page, and maybe put acknowledgments if along the way poems are appearing in journals or online sites or anthologies. And then as I write poems, I add, and there are times when I look and I say, these poems don't fit. These poems may not actually contribute to the overall structure that I'm sensing as I go forward. And there may be a little bit of juggling of poems, but interestingly, I would say many times the poems are very close to the order they were written chronologically. And that's not even a deliberate decision that I make. I will pull poems out of their chronological order and place them somewhere else because they seem to fit better there. And that question of fitting, I usually do just by instinct, really. But I do try to pay attention that a collection of poems varies its tones quite a bit. In other words, I wouldn't put all gloomy poems together or all swift little upbeat poems together, but to vary them. And from this, I honestly, I've taken guidance from many poets who've gone before me, but I also take just as much guidance from good musicians, good bands of music. No, no fine musician would only hit you with long, slow ballads or really upbeat rock songs. You have to vary it and get the mood moving around and really keep a kind of circulation of energy.
You could be speaking about the individual poems and how certain surprise things comes up and other techniques come up to keep it kind of lively in that way.
Absolutely, yeah. And then a final thing would be considering whether a book of poems should have sections, maybe, so that it can be approached in smaller segments than an entire book. And this book, Forests, Temples, Glacial Rivers, the publishers asked if maybe I would do that because I had delivered it as a single manuscript, and that suited my temperament well. And I do like books that have divisions in them, and you get a little clue from the poet that there are ways of reading the book. It's like a secret way of slipping in extra titles.
Right. You mentioned the publisher. Can you talk to us about your historical relationship with Empty Bowl Press and what they mean to the world?
Sure. Empty Bowl Press was founded in Port Townsend by a group of poets who were very influenced by the sort of early gestures of bioregional thinking. And so it was founded in a way as being a bioregional press, particularly serving people on the Olympic Peninsula, and then a wider sense of bioregion from that. Founded, I think, in 1976, and very much with a sense of camaraderie with things that were happening further south in uh, Shasta bioregion, or sort of Northern California. Empty Bowl was founded in what eventually came to be called Cascadian. That's something you've worked with a great deal, Paul, and put together anthologies of poetry and also interviews, that sort of thing. You could say, walked into the community when uh, now dead poet named Mike O'Connor came to Colorado and wanted to study at the Jack Kerouac School. And Mike and I became very good friends, and we did a lot of hiking in the high mountains together. He was really, for 2 years, my closest climbing companion in the Indian Peaks and Front Range Mountains. And when he moved back to the Olympic Peninsula, he he resuscitated Empty Bowl Press. This was in the early 2000s, and Empty Bowl Press had been dormant for a while, and Mike took it back and started it again. And he did a book of mine called Old Tail Road. And eventually, Mike passed on the press to Michael Daly, and then Michael Daly, oh, I'm not sure, 5 or 10 years ago, passed the press on to Holly Hughes. And so it continues moving around from poet to poet, and has really reemerged, reinvigorated, I think, at this point. And Empty Bowl itself refers to a number of interconnected ideas. It's a great symbol of Zen aspirations. It's also perhaps a reference to the Great Salish Sea or Puget Sound region, which is something like a bowl-shaped ecozone. And so I find many ramifications there. And it's also publishes good friends of mine, including Michael Connor, Red Pine, so Tim McNulty, a variety of poets. Sybil James, who I met recently, doing great translations from the classical Chinese of Li Jingzhao, maybe the best known Song Dynasty Chinese woman poet. So I felt very invited in there. And this new book, Forest Temples, Glacial Rivers, like many of my books, I slip in quite a few translations from the Sanskrit.
Yeah, that was my next question. You made a conscious decision to mix in translations from your ongoing Sanskrit project into a book of poetry and your responses to them. So there'll be a poem in translation, and then you have a response to it. Um, is there a piece? Well, first of all, tell us about the decision to do that, to mix the translations with your own work and actually mix them in the individual poems.
Over the years, I've moved in a sort of rhythm. I do three kinds of writing, as I think of it. I do poetry, I do translations of poetry from India, old India, classical India, or medieval India, and I write essays. And there are times when a book has come out and it's maybe one of those genres, and I decide the next book I should work on would be another one. And I found myself in a place where I couldn't decide if I wanted to write more poetry or really dive into a book of translations. When I get into translations, it becomes all engrossing. Uh, and then I thought, why not try a little bit of both? And I'm not even sure how exactly it came about, but I had this idea that I could do these translations primarily by a about 7th century poet named Vidya, a woman poet, very little known of her life, survived by only about 33 or 35 poems. But I thought that I could do a translation and then respond to the translation with a poem of my own, which would have been an acceptable, in fact, admired practice in Vidya's day. people collaborated and people wrote responses to one another's poems, just as they did in China and in Japan, where it was even more formalized. So I began to do that, and I wanted I wanted to take time between each of these because I felt that one of the perils might be a formulaic approach to this kind of writing. And I wanted each of my response poems to be decidedly different from previous ones so that they didn't feel like I had just hit on some kind of method and then um, moved with it unconsciously. You know, when you mention the substrata, like the substrata of mind, or perhaps the you know, wild unconscious that runs through all of us. I wanted to be able to go down there in new ways each time.
The formulaic gets boring right away. Is it's just like, why aren't you making a chest of drawers rather than a poem if you're going to do it like that? That's my feeling about it. You know, I was going to ask you to choose what might be a good example of such a poem, but I think the title poem actually works quite well. And there's a question about a phrase in there that I'd like to follow up with. So that's page 72 in the
Good,
book.
good. So this will open with Vidya from a collection that was put together in around the 11th or 12th century called the Subhashita Ratnakosha. Subhashita is a fancy term for crisp little poems, and Ratnakosha means a treasury of gemstones. So this is a treasury of gemstones of crisp little poems, interestingly put together by a Buddhist abbot in the area now that would be the state of Bihar now in India, northern India. Um, and this is an anthology that has fascinated me for a long time. Can talk about that a little bit later, but this will open with a Vidya poem and then go into a response poem. Forests, temples, glacial rivers. What of those vine-tangled groves on Mount Kalinda's glacial riverbank? Cowherd girls took shelter, making love where Radha climaxed in secret, but traveler, gone are the days I'd arrange soft tendrils for sweet fuck on the ground. Tell me, have the year's green shoots gone brittle, the gleaming blue petals dried out? Vidya's poem have I translated for love, for a name folded in these pages, hidden. The North American bear, I'm told, effaces its tracks in the creek's rocky bed, scatters broken pine boughs to wintry grotto sleep and love. She gave me a map to study old earth contours. Winter brought the bright transfer of constellations, compass of revolving myth. The legends recur. 14th day January, glacial moraines tumble through our bodies. I burn sage for Lady Vidya. Temple, forest, light dark, green.
Constellations, compass of revolving myth. God, when you read that, I hadn't caught that the first time and catch it the second time. How beautiful. And the fact that you do burn sage for Lady Vidya, I think that's a sweet gesture. Tell us about that and also about translating a particular phrase as in English as sweet fuck. I think those two things, I don't say require explanation or elaboration, but I'd be interested.
Mhm. Well, the sage is, I live in a region where sage is not only our main local incense, but also it's the purifying smoke used quite a bit by indigenous tribes and picked up by all sorts of people. And you can go into many local stores and get locally grown sage in bundles. And I tend to use that instead of incense because it comes out of my bioregion. I see no reason to import incense from India or Japan when I can use something local. And so whenever I was writing that poem, I was clearly burning sage with a sense of offering to a great poet who lived something like 13, 1400 years before me. As for the term sweet fuck, that's a complicated one. This I could talk about this for a long, long time. But to put it very concisely, the old Sanskrit poets believed that love should be curated by the poets. And we have had a really, I think, unfortunate situation in Western civilization where the language of love got kind of expunged by um, tyrants and churches, basically. And when it was picked up on the one hand by medical clinicians who had to talk about it. So we have very Latinate terms like copulation, fornication, and then we have, kind of despised language of the ordinary people that was sort of pushed aside as gutter talk, fucking, screwing, you know, make up your own list of words. And it's very hard to find delicate, elegant terminology for sexual love in the middle. We just have not re-evolved it. Whereas the Sanskrit poets really had it. And it was they were able to write about love without it seeming either coldly anatomical or, um, ferociously vulgar. So I've spent long, long time trying to figure out how to do this. We have a lot of evasive or sort of euphemistic phrases like making love, but that's a little bit different than the passion that you get in the Sanskrit. And it finally, I think that was the first poem where I finally decided why not use one of our words, but by putting sweet fuck as a single word. I hope that the sweetness of it would come through and not the vulgarity of it come through.
No, it's absolutely true. It's absolutely effective. It's perfect. It's real poetry. And I think, as a future title, you might sell more books if you called your next book Sweet Fuck. I'm just a suggestion.
I'll give it a thought, Paul. Yeah, yeah. We'll have to see what happens with the new censorship under our current administration that's just taken office. Yeah.
Yeah, that is offered as a joke. However, I would not take it that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyhow, I have similar locutions in a few of these poems because it is something that I've thought about in decades of translating the poetry and how there's almost a blank spot in the middle of our language for clearly what's one of the most meaningful and intimate and rejuvenating and beautiful activities that we have.
Who can say no to it later? To quote Ted Berrigan. You know better than I, being the Pound scholar that you are, that Ezra Pound warned, I guess it was about 1912, that a poet writing in open form can't just cut up mediocre prose into line breaks and expect it to be poetry. Yet that is much or most of what we have in contemporary poetry at this time. Um, I hate it. I often will look at a poem and disassemble the line breaks and see that it is, in fact, mediocre prose, and it makes me crazy that people continue to fall for this. I look for something different in it. And you are able to avoid that in your own work. And I'm wondering what kind of does it come naturally? Is it organic for you? Do you have to work at it? Is there a collage thing involved? Is it done in the post composition editing process? Can you give us some sense as to how you are able to create poetry that is not just mediocre prose chopped up into line breaks?
The line break is the poet's principal tool. That's where you establish rhythmic values, but also uh, regulate the movement of sounds through a poem. So it really is a musical act there. You're working both with rhythms and with tones in a way. It's not the same tones that you talk about with music, but it is the tones of our speech and our language. And I've spent a long time at it, and it's interesting because um, I had early on rejected as uninteresting most of the received forms that came out of English poetry, as most people of the last few generations have. There's always a crew of people who like to work with those received forms, and some of them are very, very good, and it fits their temperament, but it did not fit my temperament. Um, but during the read the comp, during the time that I put this book together, and more so even in just recent months, I've begun to go back and explore the old forms and rhythms, or really metrical patterns and rhyme schemes of uh, our own language, the English language, out of an interest in what is it people have discovered about this language that we speak, and what are some of the magic qualities of it. And I made a joke the other day. I feel a little bit like the opposite of Prospero. At the end of Shakespeare's Tempest, Prospero takes a great book of magic spells and chants, which is to say, rhymes and metrical patterns, and disavows it and throws it into the ocean and repudiates all of magic. I feel like now that I'm about Prospero's age, the ocean has thrown into my hands a big book of spells and chants and metrical patterns. And so I'm working with that more now, seeing if I can work um, you know, judiciously, but with rhyme and certain kinds of metrical patterns, because I feel I've trained my ear in this other way, and now if I can bring the two of them together a little bit, to me, it's sort of interesting and exciting. And in fact, in this book, there you'll find little traces of it. There are a few poems, for instance, that end with a very notable end rhyme because it just feels like a lovely way that closes that poem.
Hmm. Yeah.
As far as, training your ear, that comes from reading a lot of poetry and looking really closely at poems that grab you and just asking yourself again and again, how does this line break work? How does this poet get this effect? And I've learned from, a range of people, from, let's say, William Butler Yeats to Joanne Kiger, Lorene Niedecker to Ezra Pound, Nathaniel Mackey to Wang Wen, just many, many people who have good ears and have developed that sense of things.
Well, Huynh, who I quoted in my introduction from her
Yeah,
blurb
yeah.
in the back of the book. Yeah. There are moments of philosophy and maybe even pure rhetoric that come into the poems, and they have the quality of surprise mind. I love that Jack Spicer quote, "The muse is patient with truth and commentary as long as it doesn't get into the poem." Yet you get them into the poems and it works so well. One is on page 39. Had I a philosophy, I'd make certain nobody heard it, for one, which I love and is consistent with a notion that I remember from Michael McClure. And then do not try to master the secret techniques of power over others. And this is a regular thing with you. I remember in a previous book, all of a sudden in the middle of a poem, there's a line like, read Jack Collins' poetry, for instance. Tell us about that, how those moments happen for you in a poem.
Uh, that's a good question. I'm not even sure I can speak to that, but I do think I like often in a poem suddenly feeling another voice needs to come in. And that was from a previous book, I believe, where I had suddenly in the middle of a poem, read Jack Collins' poetry, all in capital letters. And that must have come subliminally from the wonderful poet Hannah Weiner, who had many different voices coming through her thoughts, her ears, and onto her page, and elaborated a way of working with a typewriter to get the different voices teased out in a way. And I have no idea how she did or what she was doing, but I think Uh, Probably her practice gave me an idea that you can make poems exciting by bringing in different voices. And I do have, a partial ear for, I don't know what you called it, rhetoric or philosophy or something, but I don't want to spend time there. I just want to be able to say something occasionally that comes in that way.
Yeah, it's effective. And I go back to Ezra Pound, who said that abstractions have to be earned, and one can take out the word abstractions and put rhetoric in there because it works, and they stand out amidst all the other more purely poetic work in there. The core of the book, to me, seems to be a prose poem called Word Protectorates. Um, I love that. I think that's just fantastic. It's very rhetorical and yet it's very visionary. And I think I may have marked the page. No, I don't know if I marked it, but I know that it's on page 56. And that's kind of long, but would you be interested in reading that piece?
I certainly could, yeah. And maybe I'll, say a word um, that is, in a way, one of my more didactic poems. In a way, it's like a vision into the future and trying to offer some possible guidance to people who come now and after us, ways to approach the natural world. And there's a little bit of history here. I thank in the acknowledgments two poets, Linda Russo and Martha Reed, who put together a book called Counter Desecration. Uh, I think it's a glossary for writing in the Anthropocene. And they talk about the unprecedented challenges and crises the natural world faces, and that our moment in history has been named by some people the Anthropocene, where human impact on the world has become so strong that we might almost name it as a new epoch or era. And their effort, which they articulate really well, is we need new terms for this. And so I decided to come up with some terms that are partly playful, some of them playful, some of them terms that have meant a great deal to me, some that I just, they're neologisms, they're crunched together from other words. So I can read this. I think particularly, well, so this is word protectorates, and then I have a little subtitle there, Yoga for a Time of Biocrisis. Avant totemism. Take a protector stance for an animal or plant that indicates health in a particular ecosystem. The species should be native and recognized as key to your region. Avant totemism brings eco-activists and artists into one council. Totem comes from the Ojibwa Nindodum, my ancestor, founder of my clan. The artist goes avant, out front, to protect water source, food chain, habitat, and shelter for the totem. This may require tedious meetings with the local board of adjusters. Note, avant totemism is the opposite of mascotism, fantasy use of animal as identity for sports, military, men's clubs, or commerce groups without reference to the lifeways or well-being of the species. Provençal mascoto, charm, fetish, empty specter. 2. Nostallation. This is spelled Gno. Nostallation. Knowledge of the night sky. A star chart or star wheel are helpful for constellation viewing. Field glasses, too. Gnosis. Learn night sky traditions from several cultures by heart. Pass the stories on to children. Urban lights, StarNet, intrusive military flights, and space station trash currently interfere with star lore wisdom. The Dark Sky Initiative, adopted by certain neighborhoods, hip park rangers, and some counties, is one step in reclaiming the sky commons. Lokapala, Sanskrit, protector of place, sometimes a spirit, sometimes a bio-being that dwells in a distinct ecozone. It embodies the genius of a place. Most are found where notable geoformations, water source, or medicinal plants and minerals occur. Pinnacle, hoodoo, spire, chasm, grotto, spring, rock outcropping, moss and orchid cliff, native grass meadow, old growth tree can be home of a Lokapala. Do not regard it as benign or malignant. The Lokapala guards the biospirit integrity of a place. It takes the personality of rock, tree, or weather. It might emit a fragrance of local herbs. It might be a venomous insect. Euphythric, coined from old books, the Greeks, by Percy Bysshe Shelley, under the open sky. Praise to old-time open-air temples. Most of history, people told stories, sang, made poems, and made love with sky as their roof. Free from walls, away from ceiling, computer, or thermostat. Body wakens to wind, sun, animals, plants, soil, starlight. Think how poets hearken to the Aeolian harp, found in China, Greece, India, Ethiopia, Indonesia. Tibetan prayer flags use the same winds as the harp, dispersing unheard sounds and good luck to creatures. I swear Thoreau used the term euphythric, but cannot figure out where. Vesperation, how breathing changes when the sky darkens. Catch sight of Venus, Hesperus, over the western horizon at vespers, dusk, a long inhalation, then breath settles into gentler register. The North American vesper sparrow starts its melody. Nighthawk softly booms. The human lullaby takes tender notes, and outdoors the moonshiners watch their jugs, hidden beneath the juniper, starting to fill.
I love that so much, and you read it so well. It's just so well. It's just like it sounds when you look at it on the page, and it is, it goes back to you had an essay called Post Coyote Poetics, and I think that you scrape the edge of eternity with these kinds of things. They're so amazing. I immediately read it as a tool for workshops, the kinds of things I've been trying to tell workshop folks. This is something that I want to present to them, and it's just fantastic. And in that introduction to you, I was talking about how, this book, the fruits of, 40 plus years. I wanted to be gentle, so I didn't say 50, but 40 years of study, 40 plus years. And it really comes through the potency of what you've been tracking, which seems to me very much prophetic, comes through in a piece like this. And, you know, the question that I wrote to ask you after you read that was, before I say that, as you were beginning to read that, there was a bald eagle attacking a coot raft right out here in the lake. And of course, crows and seagulls are up there in the peanut gallery saying, don't do that, don't take that coot. And I don't know if the eagle got a coot. I don't think they did. And of course, we root for them not to, although we want eagles to eat. But it's interesting how this connection to nature, as sort of suggested by that piece, is right there in the background of my screen here on Lake Washington. But the question I had was, I read these as a start for those who seek to navigate the complexity of a world so chaotic as the one in which we live. And we talked about the polycrisis. How has this kind of knowledge and these kinds of activities guided you and helped prepare to ground you for the kind of time that we live in now?
I'm not sure anything prepares us for the times that we live in now, except a study of history and to realize that this isn't new. Tyranny, despotism, the takeover of churches and states, the exclusion of vulnerable people, the extinction of vulnerable languages and vulnerable species. None of this is new. And I think maybe some of the best ways you can armor yourself and get a guide forward is to a little bit of study of history. I have no doubt that those northern barbarians and the area that we now call UK or Great Britain were feeling utterly despairing and brutalized when Roman legions came across them. Um, some of it is, just simply going to be survival skills to get through difficult times. Some of it is going to be recognizing that our strongest power is love and to never lose track of that. I am concerned that young people often don't know how to write love poems anymore. I also teach, and sometimes when I ask for love poems from young people, I don't get any. What I get is a lot of angry sex poems, a lot of wounded poems, but love. So I think love is something that we really need to work with. And of course, love is all pervasive. So the love of language is what makes you a poet or a writer. Love of other human beings is what I think will get us through these kinds of crises. But I would say most important to me, and what that particular series of, that particularly word protectorates, that word protectorate, what can we protect? And partly it's words, partly it's our language, partly it's our fresh language, but also very much the natural or biological world, which is uh, really endangered. It's very easy to get absorbed in our own tribe, our own human species, and the problems there, which is our tribe. And of course, that's who we're mostly interested in, as all animal species are kind of mostly interested in, their fellows. But we've also got an awareness of this real danger to the bioregions, the ecosphere, the biosphere. And I think recognizing on one hand the beauty of it, on the other hand, the fragility and the siege that it's all under. So, what I think one of the things I've tried to do in this book is to recognize we need to protect the earth, but maybe even more importantly than protecting it, we need to take delight in the earth and we need to love it.
Yeah. My reaction to you talking about your students writing angry sex poems was laughter at first, but then as I thought about it, it's really kind of sad. Yeah. I mentioned in the intro poems to Dead Friends, Ed Dorn, Diane DePrima, and others. As Milt Jackson and Oscar Peterson said over 40 years ago, does it feel like ain't but a few of us left? Is it getting to feel that way? Michael McClure said to me, my black address book, when we had those as little black books, feels like a graveyard.
Yeah, yeah. And yet at the same time, you see new people coming up and uh yeah, it's interesting. I have tributes to dead poets here, and we often celebrate people who have died. Um, it's much harder to celebrate people who are born, except in very little circles, because we don't yet know who that being is going to be and where their accomplishments and beauties and um, joys are going to lie. So, when a child is born, the celebration happens in a very intimate space. Um, and it's left to, us poets much more to celebrate those who have died, though I do have a poem for my granddaughter in this book. So,
Page
reaching.
109, Song for Luna Luz, right there. Yeah. Um, I was thinking that, well, the bristlecone. which I think you read. I've heard you read before. I think you read it at Seattle University when you read then. And I have that noted on, I believe it's page 70. Um, just to be sure, I can go there. Yeah, that's page 70, the bristlecone.
Would you like me to read that?
I'd love for you to read that. I'd love to have a document of that. I wish I'd recorded the Seattle U reading, but I didn't have it together.
The bristlecone. High on the talus, a twisted tree angles its burnt limbs to the sky. The black tiger fire of '89 killed it. One day I met a walker who stopped and said the tree's a bristlecone. A university science crew had made the climb, bored a sample, confirmed the species in the lab. Scarred burn marks, bark torn by wind, sun, snow, and hail. But a local friend, a botanist who knows the land, expresses doubts. He thinks the old timer's a limber pine. Once, after a November visit, sun and wind, I lay down for a nap. The knotted roots, the wind-scraped branch, and dreamed McClure showed up that day, alive as you or me. You didn't die, I say to him. I never die, says he. He lifts his hand, but not to mine. No tossed-off phrase comes to his mouth beside that pine. Torn, savage whorls like the tree's rough bark, his eyebrows lower. Now's the time to take up Shelley's poems, says he, voice gruff as I lean to hear the words. No hermeneutics fit the poems. The professors, they mean well, but always get it wrong. Divine love, anarchy and grace, that hard, cold eye intending murder to the state. Songs of hope for people in his train, his care for children, love of wild terrain, hand-built boats and temples open to the sky. He searches for the heart of exile the way he tosses ash on gods, on law, on demagogues. Read the surface. It's in the words you see. You cannot bore a sample from the tree to know his thought. The bark has scarred and burnt. Shelley lives in limbs of this old pine. Greet those you meet with love, the one eupythric act. That word, eupythric, a power trembles through the soil. Physics of wind and storm spur hard dark clouds across the peaks, and then his white tufted hair and brows quicken to black. Blood enters his cheeks, the way wind whips the last coals of a fire to glowing life. But dry, quick rain, the black hair stormed by hail, goes white, chaff to the storm. His words torn by wind, the vision scatters. What's left? A corkscrew charcoal trunk, bare limbs, the flint-white clouds. Under a changeful sky, you and I could live like that, say I. I never die, says he.
I think I might have asked you before in a setting like this what you thought McClure's legacy was going to be, but I don't remember the answer.
Oh, I'm not sure that you asked me. I don't know. Uh, Let me turn it back to you and ask you what you think his legacy will be.
I think the fact that at his first reading, when he was, what, 23 years old at the Sixth Gallery, and he was reading for the death of 100 whales and was lamenting this treatment of sentient beings long, long, long before there was an environmental movement, before Silent Spring was published, I think gives us a clue as to part of how he'll be remembered. I think his use of projective verse is unparalleled. I don't think anyone has extended Charles Olson's ideas as much as McClure, and it is his practice of projective verse that I use to best articulate what Olson was talking about to workshop participants. It's been tremendously influential on my life, meeting Michael in 1995 and interviewing him for his book, Three Poems, featuring Dolphin Skull. My life will never be the same after that moment. I liken it to Miles Davis hearing Charlie Parker on the jukebox in East St. Louis and not knowing who Charlie Parker was and just hearing that and just having his mind blown. And then Miles spending the rest of his life attempting to recreate the energy of that moment and creating Birth of the Cool, creating Kind of Blue, creating fusion, and on and on and on. I remember Miles at a dinner at the White House. Nancy Reagan didn't know who he was. And she said, "So who are you?" And he said something about, "I've changed the face of music 6 times. Who are you besides someone who fucks the president?" or something like that. So that's the moment that Michael was for me. And so when you read this, I mean, if all they knew about Michael was hearing your poem that you read just now, they'll begin to have a sense. But then if they read his work, Dolphin Skull and um, Touching the Edge, Dharma Devotions from the Hummingbird Sangha and Ghost Tantras, just for starters, I think they would find that poetry can change consciousness.
Yeah, and I'd go a step further. That poem in particular is a vision after his death. He appeared to me. One of my close friends said to me, "Was that a real vision or did you just make that up?" Which reminds me of the Robert Creeley title. Is that a real poem or did you just make it up? um, but McClure counseling me to read Shelley in that vision. And there's a lot of Shelley in that poem too, but I, want to point out poets don't just emerge out of nowhere. Behind Michael McClure was Percy Bysshe Shelley. Behind Percy Bysshe Shelley was, a variety of people, including, very importantly, the classical Greek poets, all of whom factor into that word eupythric, which in the vision or the dream McClure used for me. So, uh, I think it's incredibly important to cherish our poets, especially when they're gone. I think it's equally important to see a kind of protoplasm or DNA, to use McClure-like terms, that pass on through time. And poets don't erupt out of nowhere and are not just individual. You mentioned McClure extending the practice of projective verse articulated by Olson, and Olson having picked it up from his study of Pound. And, behind them are so many poets. And that's where our practice becomes really exciting, is, we're not alone accruing to ourselves any sort of glory. We're joining a company of poets. And that may be why I have so many tribute poems to poets both in this book and, other books a little bit too. But this one has Diane DePrima, you know, um, it has Michael McClure. It has Ed Dorn. So a great many. Amity Baraka shows up in there.
Philip Whalen,
Philip
Michael
Whalen.
Connor, Daniel Ellsberg, who's not a poet, but a noteworthy human being.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, how you speak of these poets, I see also as sort of a poetry dharma lineage in a way, and that new taste for a bit of formalism comes up in that poem. So it was good that that was an example. I think we're just about out of time, but there's one last poem. I know you've been doing a lot of reading, and so I hesitate to ask you to read one more, but page 93. Trees have life, just over a page, so maybe that's not too bad. I'd really like it if you read that, and maybe we'll just close on that one for today.
Good. Good. Trees have life. Katsu Matauta says to Jaime Nangulo, trees have life, rocks have life, mountains, water. The stones talk to each other just as we do, and the trees, the mountains talk to each other. You can hear them sometimes if you pay close attention, especially at night, outside. This is not an idea to study. It is not an idea at all. You live in a world where trees, rocks, animals, creeks and springs, craggy mountains speak, or you don't. When the mountains talk to one another, is it that they too have a heart for mystery? At night, go to them. Go to the winter hills. Crouch in a stand of pines. The wind is gone. Quiet. The life force of plants withdraws inward for winter. The needles, the branches, the cones, they breathe. They gesture. Each pine bristles with intelligence. Not thinking, not dreaming. Intelligence. 2. What's the botany book say of trees at night? They exhale oxygen. We stand without words in the north woods, awake as they sleep. The great bear rotates above. Moon, my love, breathing, we breathe to each other. A forest of words. Moonlight stirring the air. 27 degrees the air has not stirred. The pines move. They move in a great council around us.
Amen, Andrew. Thank you for your time and for all that you do. It's really a blessing. Forests, Temples, Glacial Rivers, poems by Andrew Schelling, published by Empty Bowl Press of Chimacum, Washington.
Thank you, Paul.